Okay, so this week we are going to talk about some early American cultures. So we just kind of reviewed a little bit of what we talked about last week. So these are the groups that stayed here in what is now the United States. At the time, it was not the United States. But these are some of the groups that kind of hung out in our area. And actually, one of them was very close to home. So we'll talk about those in just a minute. But we'll start with a little story. You're looking out the window of a plane as you fly over southwestern Ohio. All of a sudden, something amazing catches your eye. You see what looks like a huge snake that seems to be slithering its way across the countryside. It looks as if it's built out of mounds of soil. It's probably about 3 feet high, as tall as you may have been in kindergarten or first grade. What in the world can this be, you wonder? Is it an unusual landform? You think it must have been built by people, but who would have built it, and why? Was it built recently or long ago? What is this mysterious mound? And I know you see over here in the picture, it's kind of harder to tell because it's a black and white photo. But I'll make sure that I include a picture somewhere in this module where you actually get to see it. But you can kind of see it, pardon my pun, but snaking around through here. Right, and this is actually called the Great Serpent Mound, and this is in Ohio, so very close to where we live. And we're going to talk about that group right now. So the group that made that was called the Mound Builders. Pretty good name for them, right? So the snake-like mound that you just read about is real, called the Great Serpent Mound, and it's near Hillsboro, Ohio. It was built more than 1,000 years ago by people often called the Mound Builders. They were one of several early American Indian groups that once flourished in North America and then disappeared. Today we find signs of towns that no longer exist in many parts of our continent. The mound builders culture began about 3,000 years ago and lasted about 2,500 years. Most mound builders lived east of the Mississippi River. The land there is rich in forests, fertile soil, lakes, and rivers. This we already know, right? Because when we were talking about the Midwest region, we know that it was called America's breadbasket, right? There's lots of good soil for farming. The mound builders were farmers who lived and settled in communities, and their main crop was corn. Again, just like us now, right? And we talked about last time how it was such a big game changer that the Native Americans learned how to farm, that they learned about agriculture, that they could grow their own food and stay in one place. And this is the perfect example of that. They learned how to farm and they got to stay in a place that provided them a lot of good resources and a lot of good things to survive. The mound builders were not a single group of people. The three main groups were the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Mississippians. They built thousands of mounds in many different shapes. The Cahokia in present-day Illinois, a mound that rises 100 feet as tall as a 10-story building. Some mounds were burial places for important chiefs. Some, like the Great Serpent Mound, may have been built to honor animals that were part of the mound builders' religion. Many of the mounds had platforms where religious or other ceremonies were held. A ceremony is an activity done for a special purpose or event, such as a birth, wedding, or a death. And I want to talk about this for a minute because I don't think it's hard to grasp the idea of this. So, first off, I want to show you the Cahokia mounds that they were talking about. So here are some pictures, right? It looks pretty unimpressive to us today. I feel like most of us would look at that and think, okay, it's a big mound of dirt that's got some stairs up it, right? But I think what is so amazing about this that we maybe don't always understand is the fact that these people built these mounds without the tools that we have today. So they're not having like construction equipment and excavators and earth movers and those kinds of things. They had themselves to use, and that was it. So just with their body, maybe a few tools that they had made, maybe some shovels or some things, but they didn't really have much. So the fact that they're building these 100-foot mounds just by, just using their body is pretty amazing. Thinking about that Great Serpent Mound. So let me find a picture of that too. so you can see it in color because it's kind of amazing. So if we look at it in color a little bit, it really does look like a snake, right? We've got the tail, we've got the body winding. Think of how long this is. I mean, this is an aerial view. These are individual trees, so think of how long this would be. They didn't have airplanes, right? They had no way to get up into the sky to plan these things out. So not only they were planning these things from the ground, right? They think that, we want to build this great serpent mound possibly to honor, some part of their religion, and they had to plan this all from the ground. They had to move these things from the ground. They had to build this mound. So not only are they building a tall mound, but they're also building it to create a shape that they can't see from the ground with only tools that they've made out of the small resources that they have available to them and, their own hands. That's incredible. I could not imagine doing that. That's just insane to me. Okay. Sorry, had to nerd out on that for a minute. Let's get back into our reading. The mound builders left many clues about their way of life for archaeologists to study. Remember, archaeologists we talked about were those scientists, those super smart people that study clues and artifacts from long ago to kind of figure out what the lives were like of these people. Being able to build such enormous structures shows that they were very well organized. Hundreds or even thousands of workers had to be directed to dig up tons of earth with the hand tools available. Then the earth had to be moved often over long distances to a mound location. So that's another thing. If we look at these, they didn't tear up the dirt that was around the mound to use because they wanted the area around the mound to look really nice. So they were probably walking several 100 feet, several yards, maybe even a mile to move dirt from one area and then create the mound in another. Crazy, right? So they had to move over long distances. They only had so many tools available to them. And then finally, they had to create the shape that the builder planned. So they had to be extremely organized. They had to be pretty creative people. They had to be the type of people that can envision things or see things in their mind. I am not one of those people. I wish I was, but it took a lot of skill. Artifacts also told us that trade was important to these builders. Knives found in mounds were carved from a rock called obsidian that came from the Rocky Mountains. So let's do a mountain map of the United States. Okay, so these people are living over here, okay, in the Midwest area. The Rocky Mountains are all the way over here. So they found traces of a type of rock that's found here all the way over here. So they're choosing to believe that these people probably didn't walk all the way from the Midwest over to the Rocky Mountains. Somewhere in between here, they're meeting people that already lived in this area and they're trading with them. They're finding resources that they have here and they're trading it for things that they want in another place. Let's see. Seashells, often used in jewelry, came from the Gulf of Mexico. We've talked about the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico, I know this is kind of small, but Gulf of Mexico all the way over here in the southeast region that we're getting ready to talk about. Let's see. Seashells and jewelry were found from the Gulf of Mexico. Copper came from hundreds of miles near the Great Lakes. We know where the Great Lakes are. Mica, a glittering mineral the people of Cahokia prized, came from the Appalachian Mountains far to the east. So all of these things, these materials coming from different places just show us that these people also found ways to trade and connect with other Native American groups in the area. And down here at the bottom, if you see, there's that the mound that we just looked at, that great, the Cahokia Mound. So here we've got the Serpent Mound and the Cahokia people, like we said, right here in the Midwest. But we're going to switch a little bit and we're going to talk about the Anasazi. And the Anasazi were a group that lived around the Four Corners. If you don't know what the Four Corners are, that's where Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona meet. There's actually a little place right here that you can stand and be in all four states at once. But definitely very different climate, very different landforms, very different culture than here in the Midwest. So we're going to talk about that Anasazi group that lived right here. So another farming group, so they did farm even though they were in a different place, was the Anasazi. They lived in today the Southwest states. Their name is a Navajo Indian word for the old ones. meaning that the Anasazi were the ancestors or the people that came before the Navajo Indian groups or Native American groups. The Anasazi communities were located in the Four Corners today. We just saw that on the map. Let's see. The Anasazi lived in this area from about the year 100 to about 1300, so a long, long time. The Anasazi grew things that we would consider like fall foods. So they grew corn, squash, beans, and pumpkins. Those were the type of crops that grew well in the area that they lived in. Like the mound builders, they lived in permanent communities. Again, we talked about farming is the reason they were able to settle in one place. Agriculture, that big fancy word for farming. That's why they got to stay in one place. They didn't have to keep moving around. Although the climate just means the weather in the Four Corners region is dry, that didn't limit them to farming. They dug, oh, guys, this is another one. I'm going to nerd out for you for a minute again. So I nerded out over the mounds. I'm going to do this again because these people were so smart. This is so smart. So they live in this area where it's super dry, not a lot of rain. Okay, the ground's not the best for farming. Okay, a lot of clay, a lot of dust, not like the ground that we have here in the Midwest. Okay, so what they did is they dug these ditches. So ditches just mean, a way to connect water from one place to another. So they dug the ditches to carry water from streams to the crops in their field. They knew they weren't going to get enough rain. So they dug these waterways to connect the water to the plants they were trying to grow. And this is now what we call irrigation, something that you'll see farmers do today. But I want to show you this irrigation. Native American irrigation. So you some pictures. Because this is just incredible. Okay, so they have their stream, right? This is obviously not a real photo. But they have their crops and they dug these little waterways, so like these little canals, where they could connect to water sources to their crops. So they're not going back and forth between the water every single day. They bring the water to them. How smart is that? That's so incredibly smart. And like I said, we still use this today. Here's another picture example where they've dug the waterways. It also benefits them because then they have water for them near their crops, right? And just for whatever purpose they need. So let's see, current day irrigation. Okay, so you guys have probably seen this before. You've probably went by a farm and seen the big contraptions that have the wheels on it that make it so that the water, they can water their plants, especially when it's really dry. The reason that we know how to do this today is because of those Native Americans. Literally 1,000 years ago, people figured this out, and it's something we're still using today because it was such an inventive and good idea that we're using that. That's crazy to me. Okay, nerd out moment done again. The Anasazi were also known as the cliff dwellers because they sometimes carved houses in the sides of cliffs. They also built apartment-style buildings, several stories high on the top of mesas. I'll show you what a mesa looks like. So a mesa is just a big hill with a flat top. So it almost looks like a mountain that somebody's cut the top off. So they've built their homes on top of these mesas. And mesa, like we said, just a high flat land. Mesa actually means table in Spanish, so that's where they got that from. And part of the reason that they did this was protection. So they wanted to protect themselves from other Native American groups or maybe other animals. Okay, just a way to keep away from people and things that they didn't want to be harmed by. So pretty smart. We'll also look at some of the pictures of the cliffs here in just a minute. So here in Present-Day Colorado, there's a community called Mesa Verde, and we're going to see these big cliffs. So the Cliff Palace, I want you to see this in color because that picture is pretty terrible. Mesa Verde. This is also crazy. First off, first picture, look how big, okay? This giant cliff that's hanging, and they've built their homes underneath here. So they've actually, dug out this home that was available to them, okay? This is people current day, right? But this still is there, It's still there. That's how well they built these things. Okay. And the reason that they did this, again, was for protection from enemies, from animals, also from the weather. Because, like we said, we'll get to this area when we're talking about regions, but this is an extremely hot, extremely dry, always sunny kind of area. So the cliff helped protect them from the sun and the weather and the elements, but also helped protect them from enemies and animals, which is just so incredibly smart. I think this is another one that's super inventive, um, and just would have taken so much time. Like we said, they didn't have the tools that we have now, right? They don't have the construction equipment. They were using very, very little amount of tools and pretty much just their hands to be able to do these things. Crazy. The largest building in the Cliff Palace has about 150 rooms. It also has 23 kivas, and kivas are these large underground rooms, almost kind of like what we would think of basements today. And kivas were important to their religion. So there were these places, it was almost like a basement church. Anyway, they were where they held religious ceremonies. And in their culture, men were only allowed to enter kivas. So women were unable to enter kivas. Again, we're not positive why. That would be, something we'd have to keep looking into, but that was just part of their religious beliefs. All around you, people are using these beautiful woven baskets. They're so tightly and expertly woven that they can even hold water for cooking. Coals are put in the baskets with corn that's been ground into flour, beans, and other foods to make a stew. So they were found other ways to make tools besides just, construction equipment, right? They made these beautiful baskets that they use for food and water. The Anasazi culture reached its height in about 1100, but then something mysterious happened. They suddenly abandoned their villages and left. We have no idea. So, like, super cold case. We talked about cold cases, right? Reason or things that we don't know. We don't know the answers to. We have no idea, but we do have some guesses. So we talked about theories, guesses that we make, right? Educated guesses. And one theory is that a drought or a long period without rain forced them to leave. So they'd had their irrigation, they had super smart ways of getting what they needed as far as the water goes, but they couldn't last forever without it. So maybe there was a super long drought that caused them to find somewhere else to go, to leave. Streams may have dried up, irrigation became impossible, the Anasazi had to move to find another place to farm. Historians believe that the Pueblo people of today's Southwest include the Hopi, are descendants. So descendants mean that like the grandkids and the great-grandkids of the Anasazi. It says something about the biography feature. I don't have that in here. But there are people that are still living in the Four Corners area that they think are probably related to those Anasazi people. And then the last little bit are the Inuit. The Inuit are very far north, so in what today is Canada. So those would have been the first people to stop after they would have crossed that land bridge. And the Inuit actually means the people. Like the first Americans, they traveled from Asia to North America, but the Inuit came in much later. So this would have been a later group, probably about 2,500 years ago. They make their homes across the frozen lands near the Arctic Ocean from Alaska through Canada. So let me find Inuit. So they would have lived way, way up north. So parts of Canada, maybe even over here in Alaska. So super, super up north. So obviously a big shift in climate from the Southwest region that we were talking about. So we're talking about super duper cold, right? The Inuit adapted to life in the cold climate. They hunted. They hunted whales, walruses, and seals. Obviously, they didn't farm. The reason they didn't farm, let's look at that map again. I don't think anything's grown up here, right? You're not going to get too many things to grow in the snow. So they weren't farmers. So they continued to focus on hunting just because of the climate and the area that they lived in. They also were the first to develop the kayak, which is pretty cool. If you've ever been kayaking before, you can thank the Inuit people. They were the ones that invented this, and they used it for hunting, but they also used it for transportation, so a way to get from one place to another because they were around a lot of water. In the winter, some Inuits still build traditional houses called igloos, and you guys have probably seen igloos before, but let's just look again. So obviously, this is going to be a more accurate representation, right? Igloos, they are built out of snow and ice. They did have some holes because they were able to build them and have fires. And then obviously you see they're dressed for the climate that they're living in. You can even see one of those kayaks back here in the background, which is pretty cool too. So the Inuit, obviously we don't have as much about them, but again, most of their life revolved around the hunting, and they did have to move somewhat. So they were not quite the same. Agriculture didn't change their lives like it did the other groups. So, okay, nerd out moment on the Native Americans done for today. Don't get me wrong, I'm going to nerd out on other groups of Native Americans, but you're getting ready to head to the next page where I'm going to explain how you will finish the activity for today.